Good morning, all, once again, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're beaming in from. Um, my name is Jerry Purcell, and I'm here today with Peter Glasheen, who's our head of faculty for Innovation 360, today to talk about behaving in a risk-averse manner. So, Peter, um, why don't we start with you providing a little bit more information about yourself?
Cool. Thanks, Jerry, and great to be here. So, for those of you that don't know enough about me and those that might want to know a little bit more, by background, I work with CEOs and executive teams internationally on strategy and innovation governance, particularly around decision making under uncertainty. I've been part of the Innovation 360 ecosystem since 2016. I was the first licensed practitioner globally to reach black belt level and now sit on the faculty, which means I've had the privilege of working with the framework and the data set across multiple sectors and geographies as well. Alongside that, I run my own advisory practice where we focus on helping executive teams make better strategic and innovation investment decisions before problems show up in execution or worse financial performance. So, this conversation today, Jerry, sits right at an intersection of both those worlds, data and governance.
Thank you, Peter. Peter's my hero. He's the first guy I saw presenting some of the material in the Innovation 360 space, and it was like, wow, like this guy knows a lot of stuff. So I'm sure you'll hear some things from Peter that will you'll find amazing. Maybe a couple of things you won't find amazing. Who knows, Peter, eh? So welcome, Peter. So as many of you know, those of us at i360 have been working with clients and practitioners collecting data on over 10,000 organizations around the globe for some time. Not too long ago, we celebrated our 10th anniversary. And we look back and we asked ourselves two questions. What stands out from our research and our data? And are there observations that continue to surprise or alarm us? And the answer is yes. And this was the genesis of the seven secrets of innovation. And today, the third in the series. And today's focus is risk. In our review, and to our continued surprise, only 50% of organizations surveyed innovate for radical changes and improvement at all. This has been reflected without a major variance over the 10 years that we've been collecting data. While popular rhetoric suggests that organizations must take moonshots and accept failure, the data shows that most organizations are highly risk averse in their innovation cultures and portfolios. Of note is that only 31% of organizations say they invest in high risk, potentially high reward innovation projects, with a full 69% admitting that they avoid projects that might not return the investment. In effect, we routinely see that many organizations favor incremental improvements, short-term ROI, and low-risk projects, with radical efforts often under-supported. That is, they get stuck in Horizon 1 and starve Horizon 2 and 3 initiatives for resources. And why is that, we wondered. So today we're going to tackle that question and why some organizations take risks and why others avoid them. And more importantly, we'll see if we might understand why they are choosing not to take risks. So today we're going to go through some material over the next hour, or almost an hour perhaps. And the agenda is up on the screen. So first with the uncomfortable truth, sort of getting at the situation, and then moving through why behavior is what it is, what exposes the truth, a little bit of a case, and let's talk about how we can fix it, and talk about some additional context and some Q&A at the end. If those of you have questions as we go along, please put them up in the chat. We'll try to address those later on in the conversation this morning, or this afternoon, this evening. And we'll try to provide some time for some questions later on as well. So feel free to put stuff in the chat, and we'll try to keep track of those as we go along. So Peter, let's start with the core argument. So you say that most organizations think that they're risk averse, and in fact, they're wrong. They're not avoiding risk, they're structurally incapable of taking it. That's a pretty bold claim. What do you mean?
Well, Jerry, it sounds provocative, but when you look at the data, it's hard to argue otherwise. Most organizations think risk is a cultural issue. We need to be bolder, we need a risk taking mindset, but that's not what's really going on. Most organizations don't avoid risk because they're conservative, they avoid risk because their system makes risk unsafe. So, what we're seeing in the data isn't fear, it's rational behavior inside a constrained system.
So, so it's not culture. So where does this risk behavior come from?
You know where it comes with most things, and that is that it comes with strategy, what we call the why layer. So organizations don't wake up and decide to take risks. They're forced into it by what they're trying to achieve. So if you want growth, you must take risk. If you want radical innovation, guess what? You must take risk. And if you want market leadership, the same story. There's no version of these outcomes without uncertainty. On the other hand, if your strategy is margin optimization and incremental improvement, then avoiding risk is actually the correct behavior. So, when two companies face the same disruption and only one acts, it's not courage, it's not alignment, but strategy alone doesn't explain the behavior. Plenty of companies know full well they should take risks, and guess what? They still don't. And I suppose that's the gap between where we're going with that. They're forced into it by what they're trying to achieve: growth, radical innovation, market leadership, and like I said, none of those outcomes can happen without uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes risk.
Hmm. So that exchange that explains the sort of the intent, but not the action. So why do some companies still fail to act even when their strategy requires it?
Pretty straightforward because they lack the capabilities to manage risk. And this is the most misunderstood part of the conversation. So the dividing line isn't bold versus conservative organizations. It's between those who can manage uncertainty because they have the capabilities to do so and those who can't. And when we look at the data, four capabilities consistently separate the two. Now, let's walk through them. And first capability is what? Prototyping. So when prototyping's weak, risk becomes binary. You either approve a full business case or you kill the idea. There's no middle ground. Organizations that are strong here break uncertainty into smaller testable pieces. They build something tangible quickly, they get feedback, iterate, and reduce exposure before scaling. So prototyping isn't about creativity, it's about making risk smaller. If you can't test cheaply and quickly, avoidance becomes rational. Capability number two is pilot testing. And this is where many organizations stumble. They launch nationally before they learn locally. So strong organizations treat pilots as disciplined experiments. And Deborah will be speaking on that in the next seminar series, by the way. Clear success criteria, fast learning cycles, and rapid adaptation. Weak organizations, on the other hand, treat pilots like mini launches. When pilot testing is weak, risk stays large. When it's strong, risk becomes staged and survivable. Now, capability number three, no surprise, is risk assessment itself. This one is especially interesting in board contexts. So most governance risk and compliance systems catalog risk. They create registers, lists, and heat maps, but they don't manage uncertainty dynamically. Strong innovation risk capability asks a set of different questions. What are the assumptions here? How do we test them? What would invalidate this investment? So weak systems produce risk lists, strong systems produce learning pathways, and that's a fundamental distinction. Lastly, the fourth capability is knowledge rewarding. And even if you prototype and pilot, if learning isn't rewarded, then the system collapses. So we know most organizations reward success, they do not reward insight. So high performing innovators reward knowledge gained even when outcomes fail. So they're not rewarding failure, they're rewarding knowledge gained. And if knowledge contribution isn't reinforced, people default to what? They default to safe bets. Knowledge rewarding is what turns experimentation into institutional capability. So when we look at these four capabilities together, the picture becomes clearer. If they're weak, what happens? Risk feels large, decisions feel irreversible, and exposure feels personal. And therefore, avoidance becomes rational. If they're strong, on the other hand, risk becomes staged, exposure becomes manageable, uncertainty becomes engineered. And that's the difference. And this is why companies like Booking.com can run 25,000 experiments a year. It's not because they're braver, it's because their system supports throughput. The real question isn't, are we bold enough? It's, do we have the system to make risk survivable?
So these capabilities that Peter's been talking about are part of the framework that we use to measure innovation management, and there's 66 of them. So, but basically, in summary, we're talking about four. Four of those 66 are critical capabilities in this sort of risk tolerant environment that we're talking about. So, prototyping, pilot testing, risk assessment, and knowledge rewarding are critical capabilities in the context of taking risk.
And Jerry, just a little one here, an ad for the data. When we're referring here to strong and weak, in the data set, when you're choosing what you want to benchmark your organization against, we often talk about the top 25%. So they're the strong when we talk about strong in these examples. But it's the other 75% that are weak, and that's what we're talking about. And it is that distinct. The top 25%, there is a huge gap to their performance versus the other 75%.
So, critical question is, do we have for organizations, is do we have the system to make risk survivable? So, can you give us a sort of a concrete example of sort of the different sort of ways that this might present itself in the real world?
Yeah, sure. Let's take Amazon, easy one. They run thousands of A/B tests every year. And just so everybody's clear about that, that's another capability out of the 66, and that's A/B testing. So A version versus B version. Lots of people just launch with only the A version. So they run thousands of A/B tests every year and test them. And they launch minimum viable products, they test, they iterate, and they scale. So they're not risk loving, they're risk engineering. And I think, most people inside Amazon would know there's a lot of conservative people there that work really hard. So I kind of like that. They're risk engineering. Now, compare that to a typical large enterprise where you've got an annual planning cycle, the one big business case, and one high stakes decision. No prototype, no pilot. So that's not a cultural difference, that's a system design difference. Here I like to quote Jerry, my favorite, Deming, and one of his great quotes, which is, every system is designed perfectly for the results that it gets. And when we start mentioning system here all the way through this discussion, I'm always thinking about Deming, because if you don't change the system, then you're not going to change the outcomes. And if you're getting certain results that you don't want, it's because your system is designed that way. You have to decipher what you're going to change inside your system. These four capabilities are a great way of starting with that for risk aversion.
So leadership plays a role in this, I'm sure. So tell me about that.
Yeah, leadership's critical, but probably not in the way that people think. So what we find in terms of innovation and risk aversion is that most organizations are dominated by one style. What is it? It's structured, predictable execution. We call it spiral staircase, and that's great for running the business. It's also terrible for exploring uncertainty. So let's start with that spiral staircase style because this is where most established organizations naturally sit. Spiral staircase leadership is what? It's disciplined, execution focused, and deeply committed to improving the core business. It drives operational excellence, it's customer refinement, cost control, and incremental innovation. Over time, it can transform a business dramatically, but from within the same core model. The strength of the spiral staircase leadership is obviously reliability and performance. The risk, however, is over optimization. And when this style dominates without balance, everything improves, but nothing fundamentally shifts. So the organization becomes exceptionally good at running today's business, but structurally uncomfortable stepping into uncertain territory.
Yes, I noticed a message. There we go. I noticed a message in the chat about the slides. The slides will move only periodically. I know, I know we have you trained like Pavlov's dog to only do things when the slide changes, but we've only got a few, and so that will explain why you're not seeing them flip every time we move to a new point. Yeah, we want you to focus on Peter's face and whatever. So, anyways,
Right.
um, thank you very much, Peter. Um, so. So sometimes you talk about sort of the focus on H1 and you call it the H1 addiction. What is that?
Um, let's go through that. I thought we were going to talk a little bit more about the other leadership styles first, if we
Go for
can.
it. Why don't you do
So,
that?
because when we talked about first off, we said that most organisations are dominated by one style, the structured, predictable one we call spiral staircase. Yeah. On the other case, high performing innovators do something differently. They stack leadership styles. So let's take, for example, one cauldron. You could define this as challenge to the core. Now, the cauldron style shows up when leadership directly creates urgency. It's not incremental improvement when they do this, it's challenging the business model itself. Remember how we said spiral operates within the existing model? So, with cauldron, it often appears in moments of transformation when leaders signal that nothing is sacred, everything's on the table. But, Jerry, here's the catch: cauldron energy can't run forever. It creates heat, but not steady state governance. Without discipline, it'll burn out. And without it, organizations can drift into complacency because they don't question the status quo. The second of the leadership styles I want to talk around is Pac Man. So, Pac Man leadership's interesting as well because it recognizes you don't have to invent everything yourself. Some organizations systematically scan the market, invest in emerging players, and integrate what works. But this only works if you're strong at integration. So acquiring innovation is easy, absorbing it and scaling it, that's what's hard. Without integration discipline, Pac-Man becomes fragmentation rather than growth because it never lands in the organization. The last one I want to talk around is the fifth one on the end there, Explorer. You know, defined as funding uncertainty. So, if anything, Explorer leadership is about patience. Um, it's funding uncertainty before there's proof. Yeah, hard concept for people to get their head around sometimes. And it's running disciplined probes into areas where the outcome isn't clear yet. So many organizations talk about exploration, but they fund it like they're funding operations and expecting predictable returns. So Explorer leadership protects small stage bets long enough for learning to compound. Now, coming back to the data, it clearly shows that average firms have what? Just the one dominant style, whereas the top innovators run multiple systems in parallel. So risk taking isn't a leadership personality, it's a leadership system.
An important thing to note about the leadership styles is that in working with organizations, there are different answers for different situations. So the two that we didn't talk about in a lot of detail are spiral staircase and the fertile field. Spiral staircase is often the predominant style inside organizations, but it tends to favor H1 incremental type operations day to day, sort of operations. And it's certainly the way that you would run your factory would be using a spiral staircase style, but you don't want to run your innovation program as a spiral staircase style. Fertile field is a little bit more sort of focused on innovation, but it's a passive innovation. It's a watching the marketplace and looking for ways to apply capabilities. And so each of those has its place, but in the context of this risk situation and the fact that a different combination is necessary in different situations. In this case, Cauldron, Pac-Man, and Explorer are predominantly the case in terms of the innovation work, and perhaps the spiral staircase would be the way that they manage the sort of more sort of production-oriented and operations type, or the branches if they're a bank and that kind of stuff. Just so we understand that there's all kinds of complexities in making these decisions. So I got my H1 addiction question back. So let's talk about what you call H1 addiction, and I think it probably ties back to that spiral staircase conversation.
Yeah, it does kind of. So, this is where things get uncomfortable. Now, a balanced portfolio suggests a spread of 70, 20, 10 across horizons, Horizon 1, Horizon 2. Horizon 1 being the now business, Horizon 2 being searching for the new growth business. And, most organizations operate close to 80 to 90% in H1, effectively starving the future. There's anecdotal quotes out there that you could even be into the high 90s in percentage terms in Horizon 1 innovation. And like I said, that effectively starves future growth. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I will go back to that. I will go back to that. Yep, we'll go back to here. And give me 2 seconds. I'm on the wrong one. So, as we've said, most organizations heavily invested in Horizon 1. And what is that? That's existing products, existing markets, and incremental improvements. Now, as we said, in extreme cases, nearly all the resources go into Horizon 1. And the impact of this is that everything competes for the same budget. Yeah. So the result is what? Projects tend to get bigger. At the same time, they become slower. And of course, because they're bigger, they become more risk averse. So, as the research puts it, too many, too big, and too cautious projects that don't create value. And there's some great examples around which we probably don't have time to go into now, but I'm sure you can all relate back to something big that you've been a part of or observed. So, that's not risk aversion, that's over optimization for the short term stability, which is, we talked about the risks of the spiral staircase leadership style before.
Well, one thing we do see in organizations, especially large ones with big production shops, is that they apply the same approach to every initiative, big or small. And when we look at the cost of running the production, it's typically 25, 30, 35% too high because they're applying a hammer to something that doesn't require a hammer. And small initiatives have different governance structures and different sort of production processes. So there's an example of what the H1 addiction will do to your cost base.
Yeah, yeah, we can see that, and even then, it becomes around prioritization, doesn't it? You should be trying to have different amounts of money spent and only creating the winners, which is stuff we're going to talk about in the next section.
So one of the things that we've done some research on is why it is that sometimes in times of crisis that some organizations reach for the top and find themselves being much more successful. So the way I like to talk about this section is that, and then a crisis happens. So let's talk about crises, Peter. Why do some companies thrive and others collapse?
I think it's because crises don't create winners. What they do is they reveal them. So let's have a look at COVID. What happened in COVID? And back to Amazon, plus 38% revenue. Zoom, plus 326% revenue. Shopify itself, it doubled. Now, they didn't suddenly become innovative. what they'd done is they already had experimentation systems, scalable platforms, external ecosystems, and multi horizon investments. So they were what we call pre adapted to what happened. Yeah. Meanwhile, many incumbents, what did they do? Well, they did three things. They cut innovation, they froze decisions, and waited. Result, and they lost ground. So crises expose capability gaps, not strategy statements. So now let's go with the second example. Go back a little bit further, still in everybody's memory here, the 2008 financial crisis. What happened then, Jerry? We saw the Canadian banks. What were they? They were stable. Why? They're H1 optimized and low exposure. However, let's take some other geographies. US and European banks, we saw a couple of collapses there due to what? Mismanaged risk. So, not the lack of risk taking, but poor risk capability. Let's just summarize that. There's two failure modes: too much unmanaged risk, as in 2008. Second, too little adaptive capacity, the COVID example. And that's a powerful contrast. So, like I said, there's actually two ways to fail with risk. One is taking too much unmanaged risk, as we saw in 2008, and the other is having too little adaptive capacity, as we saw during COVID.
Let's take the Canadian banking example just a little bit further. And I think we can actually integrate observations about other markets like Australia as well. But
Yep.
sometimes it gets labeled as risk averse. Tell me why that label's wrong.
Yeah, it is wrong. The label is wrong. So Canadian banks are not risk averse. What they are is they're perfectly aligned to their environment. Let's look at that environment. It's a high market concentration. There's strong profitability. Their return on equities are in that 15 to 20% mark, and there's very tight regulation. So what do you get? You get a low pressure for radical innovation. Um, you get a high cost of experimentation and strong incentives for stability. So they innovate, but mostly incrementally. That's not failure, that's fit. So what looks like risk aversion is often rational adaptation to the structure. Now, if we shift the lens to Australia, you see something very similar. The Australian banking system's also concentrated, it's profitable, and it's heavily regulated. The major banks here operate in a relatively stable competitive structure with strong margins and significant regulatory oversight as well. Now, that creates similar incentives. So they tend to protect the core, optimize efficiency, and manage downside risk very carefully. So again, what might look like cultural risk aversion is often structural fit. And so let's broaden that out then. In markets where profitability is strong and regulation is tight, the cost of experimentation is high and the urgency for radical innovation is lower. So the key question isn't whether banks in Canada or Australia should be more courageous. It's whether their systems are built to respond if the environment changes rapidly.
So think about your own experiences, your own companies or your own clients, your own business in your market. Is it is it easier for you to get funding or clients? And I would argue in some markets, the quote system is set to enable the process of getting funding, for startup companies or midstream companies or whatever. But the system is not predisposed to helping organizations to scale. And so the behavior of the organizations is totally explainable, totally rational, because the system encourages those other behaviors. And so if we're in a market where we're concerned about the growth of our organizations, the innovation that's taking place, productivity type things, then the market itself, the economy, the system has to encourage those kind of behaviors. So we go back to the question, and it's a question that needs to be asked over the long run, and maybe we talk about it during the Q&A if you like. But the question really is, In your market, is it easier for you to get funding as a client or to get a customer? It's kind of an interesting question. It makes my mind break sometimes when I think about that. But just wanted to plant that in the conversation. Okay, okay, Peter. Now,
Jerry, I'll give you.
okay,
Sorry,
go for
Jerry,
it.
I'll give you a quick ad here.
Yep,
If Jerry did a post on this in respect of R&D incentives as well recently in the Canadian context, and I saw exactly the same thing in the Australian context as well. And that same line that Jerry just told you, is it easier to get funding, i.e., a government grant, R&D grant, than it is to go out and validate something with a real customer? But I'm sure that's something that Jerry, Deborah might explore in the next session as well around experimentation. So, sorry, Jerry, back to you. That's the end
no
of your
worries.
ad.
Thanks for the promo. So now we're going to start digging deeper into Peter's brain here. So tell us, if an organization realizes that it's structurally risk averse, what should it do?
Okay, stop trying to change culture and start redesigning the system. Um, Now we've got a slide for this, Jerry.
We do.
So this might be the money slide, Jerry. I don't know. We've got the 5 moves for you, and let's talk these through one at a time. So, move number one: make risk smaller and run prototypes in weeks, not in multi-year programs. If you're thinking about prototyping in a yearly program or multi-year program, it's probably too big. So this talks to the capabilities described earlier around prototyping and pilot testing. Remember, we talked about those. They were 2 out of the 4 capabilities. Instead of asking, should we invest $10 million, ask, what can we test in 30 days? So that's prototyping and that's pilot testing. Do that for both. So what happens? Small experiments reduce your exposure. And guess what? When your exposure shrinks, so does hesitation. Hesitation shrinks as well. Okay, secondly, move number 2 is break the binary. And let's talk about replacing that one big bet with 10 small stage bets and therefore staged investments. Yeah. And firstly, what should you do? So this is sort of like sub moves, if you like, in breaking the binary. Firstly, fund discovery. Yeah. Now, what would you know? Which leadership style would you do for that? Explorer, absolutely. Also, Pac-Man, because you're investing in things outside the company, startups, etc. So, firstly, fund discovery. Make sure that you're not putting 97% all into H1. Get some of that and start putting it into H2 and 3. Secondly, then validation. Following validation comes scaling here. So validation is more prototyping, scaling more maybe pilots. And what you get is that each stage earns the right to move forward. So when decisions are staged, risk becomes manageable rather than existential. Move number 3, fund your uncertainty deliberately. And what does this mean? It means put funds towards H2 and H3 allocation. If you don't allocate resources explicitly to Horizon 2 and 3, those funds will just get absorbed by Horizon 1. And often that's one of the patterns we see in the work that we do in our practice as well is people have a new strategy that says, and they wonder why in execution the strategy is not working. And it's not a strategy problem, it's a capital allocation problem. Because what happens is they develop the new strategy, they say we've got to do this new innovation, and they allocate capital exactly the same way as what they've always allocated it. So I'll repeat that again. If you don't allocate consciously, explicitly to Horizon 2 and 3, then those funds get absorbed by Horizon 1 and nothing changes in capital allocation. Therefore, nothing changes because that's the system you designed. The next thing is uncertainty doesn't survive what I call the annual budget competition in this in this case. Yeah. So you've got to ring fence exploration, not recklessly, but make it deliberately. Where are we up to? Number four, rewiring leadership. So by this we mean, so we talked about in the leadership, add explorer or cauldron leadership styles. Um, if an execution focused leadership dominates, then by nature exploration will be suppressed. But what you don't do is remove the execution leaders. You want to keep that. You add the complementary leadership styles, like I said, explorer, cauldron, Pac-Man, etc. So, explorer, as we said, leadership to probe new ground. Cauldron leadership when transformation is required, etc. So, risk taking isn't about replacing leaders; it's about balancing the system. Number five is one of the capabilities as well, but we thought it's an important move here, and that is that remember we talked about the capability of reward learning. Um, so finally, you know, let's do that. Reward learning. Um, if only success is rewarded, then guess what? Safe bets will dominate. If insight, however, is rewarded, experimentation becomes sustainable. And because, really, until learning is safe, risk is never going to be. So the question isn't how do we make people braver? It's how do we redesign the system so that uncertainty is survivable? Because, like I said, until risk becomes manageable, avoidance will always, always, always be the rational choice.
Thank you, Peter. So now we come to the place where you guys can ask some questions, and I have some example questions that I can start with. But if you have insights, or if you wanted us to recover one of the things that we covered quickly or whatever, please make that known in the chat. Um, you'll note that, as I said, I've listed five questions here, and I thought that we might use that as a bit of a summary. Of the discussion we've already had, and I'll wait for anything to come through on the chat, and we can answer those as well. So hypothetically, what I thought I would do is come up with an answer for each of these these questions. So first question is, where does risk actually get reduced in a typical system? So this isn't going to apply to everybody, but it gives you some structure or some sort of a systemic way of thinking about it. So in most organizations, risk isn't really truly reduced. It's primarily evaluated, escalated, and debated. And we've talked about experimentation and testing and things. That's how you do that. So we do business cases, we do governance reviews, we look at approval committees to look at stages, we talk about annual planning cycles. And typical systems, they rely very heavily on a prediction rather than experimentation. So that's bad. The other way is good. The experimentation process is really helpful. In fact, choosing small little projects as opposed to big ones is also a way of accomplishing this. Because if you don't do that, then you maintain a high level of uncertainty, and innovation is all about, embracing uncertainty and sort of getting further along in terms of your knowledge of the situation. Decisions become high stakes, all of them. They're all big decisions and all, generating the right kind of feedback, as Peter talked about, or not the right kind, but the kind that would label someone risk averse. And organizations default to caution. So it's better to not do it than to do it because someone's going to lose a job. So in a stronger innovation system, risk gets reduced through prototyping, pilot testing, staged investments, and rapid experimentation. And so the key distinction is weak systems try to predict risk away. Strong systems learn risk away. They embrace the risk.
Yeah.
Reading demo. Okay, so the second one is, what percentage of a typical innovation portfolio is truly high risk, high reward? So our research suggests that only 31% of organizations invest in a meaningfully high risk, high reward innovation portfolio. So approximately 69% are avoiding projects that may not return the investment. That's actually what precipitated this session, is that kind of data being showed in our portfolio of 10,000 plus organizations. So in practice, most most portfolios are dominated by incremental improvements, adjacent extensions, and short-term ROI initiatives. And many organizations operate with 80 or 90% or more of the resources in Horizon 1. So, meaning that truly transformational innovation is often underfunded. Money is not being invested in H2 and H3. And as we know, certainty moves its way between H1 to H3 both ways. And the things that you do in the H3 space feed your H2 initiatives, and H1 feeds H2 and stuff. And it's how you grow as an organization in terms of your sort of embracing of your market. And it is a fact that organizations that don't embrace the H2 and H3 initiatives have a shorter lifespan than those that do. It just is. One of my sort of mentors used to say that if organizations operate in that H1 space all the time, then in 10 years they're not going to be on the Fortune 500.
Yeah.
Number three, what typically happens to projects that fail? Well, most organizations, failed projects lose credibility very quickly. Teams become politically exposed. He was one of them, you know. Learning is rarely captured systemically. What happened to that project? Well, we don't know. We just know we don't do that anymore because it failed. So even when organizations say they embraced failure operationally, budgets get cut, sponsorship disappears, and future risk-taking declines. And this creates a very rational fear response. So people avoid uncertainty because the system punishes unsuccessful outcomes more than it rewards learning. Our view is that learning is a really important part of innovation. And that's why you take small bets as opposed to big ones, partially to mitigate some of the risk. But you want to make sure that you're embracing this uncertainty because that's how you're going to expand your organizations. So people avoid uncertainty because the system punishes unsuccessful outcomes more than it rewards learning. Stronger innovation systems reward learning velocity, treat small failures as information, and kill weak ideas early and cheaply. I know George has got a question here. So in the O&G ecosystem, how
Oil and
come
gas.
oil and gas? There we go. Thank you, Peter. You want to answer this one? As an example, from the status quo now in Kuwait, if to be more specific, where they need to focus their portfolios for innovation. Oh my goodness. What would you recommend? Should we stick to building the system rather than maybe through capital? No, so I can only answer that in the context of generalities because I'm not an expert in the oil and gas industry. But it's our view that systems, whether they be organizational or national, are enabled by the very same capabilities that we're talking about, all 66 of them actually in some mix. And at the capital program, just to give it a little bit of a promotion, is about helping organizations and individuals within an organization to embrace some of these principles and some of these capabilities. They need to be exercised. You can't just go to a course and then all of a sudden everything's going to be good. But it does provide the underpinning for embracing some of these issues. Um, um, I don't know if I can answer the question. I don't know, Peter, you have any insights around sort of any more specifics?
I think I know where George, well, I don't know for sure, but George, what we do know around oil and gas is that when they say risk, remember they tend to be talking about, Jerry, very much operations risk, and therefore there's a lot of high safety risk. Yeah. So I think what we have to do, George, here is divorce off into innovation risk. We're not talking about safety risk. We're not talking about operations, risk to operations, that sort of stuff, because that's the stuff that gets done in those, governance risk compliance lists that we talked about before there and gets monitored. And, if this risk is identified, how is it going to be mitigated? No. Let's move it across into innovation risk talk, George. So I think what you'll find is through this, and happy to talk about that separately, but break down the system for why aren't we investing? And I think that one there's that Jerry talked about what percentage of your innovation portfolio is truly high risk, high reward. We're not talking about high risk operational or high safety and that sort of stuff. And just make them smaller, keep them making smaller. So I think the first thing, George, was the understand what is the system and what results they're getting at the moment. Remember back to my Deming example, and whenever you use Deming in industries like oil and gas, that's a very safe bet because people will just go to that. You know what I mean? But Deming's just as applicable to Horizon 2 and 3, whatever the system is we've designed. So I would suggest is look at what is their decision-making system for innovation. I don't know how you do that, the current state, then decide a future state. And then you can answer the question around whether capital complements that, um, or you do both, or it's complementary. Cool.
Thank you,
I
Peter.
hope that helped a little bit.
Thanks for the question. There you go. Thanks, Aaron.
Cool.
So I'm just going to pop to the last one, which we brought up earlier on. So question that you need to ask yourself or your clients do is what's easier, getting funded or getting a customer? And that will give you some insight into where you stand on the sort of a risk-averse continuum. But in many innovation ecosystems, particularly grant-heavy ones, it's often easier to get pilot funding, to obtain R&D grants, or to win innovation program support than to acquire paying customers, to secure procurement contracts, or to scale adoption inside large enterprises. This creates a sort of a dangerous dynamic. Organizations optimize for funding rather than
Now,
customer
Jerry,
value. Yep, go ahead.
yeah, Jerry, I think you and I had a previous conversation about this. I gave you an example like 15 years ago when I was in a global role with Philips, and I used to go to Eindhoven in Holland all the time, or the Netherlands, whichever one you want to call it. And they had 5,000 guys and girls working there in research, sorry, not R&D. R&D was aligned to the business units. But there's 5,000 people upstream of R&D in the business units just doing research. Now, when we're talking about funding, it might not necessarily be totally external funding. It could be, the organizational funding from the head office of Philips. Yeah. George, this would be exactly the same for your friends in Kuwait. There's people there competing internally for that funding. And Jerry's point here is just as much inside the organization. It's easier for them to lobby and get funding from those big budgets internally. Imagine what the budget was for Philips for 5,000 researchers inside and the competition that went under that, or getting a customer. What I know after going to Eindhoven for quite a number of years is those researchers who had got customers very early on and were able to apply that and were able to see where they could land that in a business unit, okay, they were the ones that succeeded on there as well. So um, I think about that inside your organization funding, not just about external funding like R&D grants or investors and that sort of stuff as well. Sorry, Jerry.
Oh no, that's good. That's very helpful. So and a number of the other things that we talk about, like it's really not about the ideas. It's about taking the ideas and turning them into innovation. Right? And so that doesn't mean they're static and they go through and everything gets executed. It means that there's dialogue, there's testing, there's iteration, a number of different things that take place. And ultimately, the focus is on commercialization and adoption. And adoption is the most important metric, really, because if you have an idea, it doesn't matter if it's any good or not until somebody buys it or uses it or sort of embraces it. And that's the most important thing. So, two things. Maybe if you just flip up the next slide just for a second, I want to do a little bit of a call out. There we go. So we're almost at the end. I've got one final question for Peter, but wanted to call out the fact that we've done three of these, all very well done. The third, not because of me, but because of the people who actually knew what they were talking about. The third one is today. The fourth one is next month, June. I think that's the 16th. I can't read that little writing. Same time, same channel. Failing to test and learn, and Deborah Pickfield um, from Canada will be presenting that. that session. So I'll call out to her and call out to you to sign up for that. Each of these is recorded. There will be a recording of this session, and there's recordings of the previous two and those in the future that you can use. We find that they're really good fodder for conversations internally, for in your organizations or a workshop with your clients if you're in the sort of professional services space. So take advantage of that. If you have any questions afterwards, you know how to find both Peter and I. Maybe just flip back to the slide again with all our contact information on there, Peter. We encourage you to do that in terms of anything that we can do to sort of clarify or provide additional information. So in the interim, Peter, or one last thing I have is to ask you a question. And if you could take all of this stuff and sort of summarize it into sort of one broad takeaway idea, what would you want the people who participated in this session to take away with them?
Okay, so it's kind of like to paraphrase a great line from a movie, one idea to rule them all, Jerry. Um, okay, this. Organizations don't take risks because they're bold. They take risks because their system makes it safe to do so. And if your system doesn't, no amount of culture change will fix that. Um, don't ask how to make people more courageous. Ask how to make risks survivable. That's the idea.
Great. Well, thank you very much for everybody for your questions, for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again in a month with Deborah. And I'm glad that people found the session helpful, as you can see in some of the comments in the chat. As I said, if anybody has any questions or any further points you'd like to make, then you can reach out to either Peter or myself, and we'd be glad to have continue the conversation at that point. Thank you very much, all. Those of you who are off to do more today, good luck with that. For those of you who are from North America and are just starting the day, good luck with that too. And we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you very much for everybody for coming on.
Not everybody. Bye.